getting the old guy coming back today.
All right. So, chapter 46.
Mm-hmm.
Let me make sure I'm on the right spot. Yeah. Okay. We've started the recording. So, picking up from last week, basically, the story is over. But the only thing left is for Jacob to actually come down, and then we kind of start getting into kind of like we're in, I guess, epilogue territory now, and doing like final conclusions for the whole saga. So here we go.
Chapter 47.
That wasn't it.
No,
Chapter 46.
46.
So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes.
Okay. So a couple things that I wanted to talk about was so what's happening here is Jacob is on his way right back. He's on his way back to Egypt. And he stops at Beersheba. And if you remember Beersheba is like the southernmost point of Israel. It's where like you have that phrase from Dan to Beersheba, which kind of just means from the north to the south.
That's right above the Negev, right?
Yes, it's above the Negev. So like modern day Israel goes way further south because modern Israel goes all the way down through the Negev. They have a port down low. That way they don't have to rely on Egypt to ship goods around, right? But if you remember back whenever Isaac was around, Beersheba was kind of Isaac's like main place. Like Abraham's main place was kind of like Mamre, like more towards the north. Like he spent a lot of time up there. He did go down to Beersheba, and there are stories about like he kind of like sets up an altar there. But Isaac spent, I feel like, if I remember correctly, Isaac spent like most of his time there, which is kind of why I think it words it as offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac, because like it's kind of Isaac's like altar. But also it's kind of he's recognizing that like Isaac was specifically forbidden from going down to Egypt, right? Abraham went down to Egypt, but Isaac was forbidden to go down to Egypt. But now Jacob is having to go down. And so far from Jacob's perspective, he sent his sons down, but he himself has stayed in the land. And now he's kind of like, okay, am I actually going to like abandon the land, even though we have all this promise and God told me to be here and yada, yada, yada. And so we now have God himself saying, no, it's okay, go down there. And one of the things that I want to talk about is, so there's kind of an overall theme that I think gets played with a lot in this chapter. And we've talked about a lot. And I recently read a different article today that I think played into this. And right, we've talked a lot about like identity, right, and hiding identities and all this stuff. But one of the other things that I've talked about a lot is the idea of preserving your identity, like what it takes to preserve an identity, and how that's contrasted with universalism, right? Are you getting a call from the government?
No, it's a friend, so he normally doesn't call, so it could be bad. So
Okay.
I'll go outside.
No, you're fine. Right, but we have anyways, what I specifically have written out is preservation of identity in the midst of death, which like Egypt is symbolic of, but also of the while being in the presence of the Nephilim, presence of the strong giants that are around you. And there's this idea is even going on in the story of the Tower of Babel, right? Because in the Tower of Babel, there's a lot of talk about how like all men were kind of like unified, but what's probably actually going on there is that it's like an empire, right? And that empire is subjugating people and forcing everyone to conform, this is one of the things where it was doing an interesting thing about the difference between how in chapter 10 it says like everybody was divided according to their languages, but then in there it's like, oh, everybody spoke one languages. But actually what's probably going on is that the reason why everybody was speaking one language in Babel is because it's an empire that's making everybody speak one language, which makes sense. But is also that same idea is what you have going on in the exile, in the like in the conquest for the land, right? Why they care about like not mixing with other people is because they're trying to preserve their identity. And you have this conflict that's going on with universalism, where everybody's kind of the same, versus diversity. But that also gets played in reverse whenever Jesus comes around, because Jesus takes this particular idea of a Jewish Messiah and he makes it transcultural and makes it appeal to everybody, makes it that blessing to the nations. So the ideas that I'm trying to get to for you guys right here is to pay attention to how there's this balance of what God's doing in his plan versus preserving a group and making them distinct, but then at the same time using that distinctness as a way to bring everybody together, and how that's different from this. Even, I mean, it's part of the reason why I'm talking about this is because this even plays into like modern stuff that's going on, right? And it plays into like what's going on in America, because people are like, oh, are we a melting pot, or are we like a salad or whatever, right?
We're American, man.
Right. Because
250 years.
you have this struggle of preserving. Do we preserve our identity, or do we assimilate and do all this? We've talked about that with like the history of the Jews and stuff too, where they have this problem of assimilating, and that's caused the Jews to have a lot of persecution. But it was also the means which brought about the restoration of Israel. And how even those ideas, I think, get played with a lot in this chapter and come up in a couple different ways. So one is in this part right here where he says, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again. Joseph's hands shall close your eyes. so the Joseph line there that's actually kind of the first confirmation from God that Joseph to him that Joseph is alive. Because remember, he still hasn't seen Joseph. But also in their minds and how they thought, gods were still very much territorial like beings. And so if he's saying, well, we're going to go down there and you're going to make me a nation down there, we're going to be down there for like a long time. Like, is that what's supposed to happen? Like, does this work? And it's like, okay, you're saying that it is going to work. Okay.
And you're going to be there, wouldn't they?
Right. And all of that, like this is kind of, and so one of the things I think is interesting about this is also very similar to whenever like the initial call of Abraham, right? The initial call of Abraham where I'm going to call you out from your land and what you know, and I'm going to make you a great nation. It's that same call, but now in a position where he's having to give up what he thought was the goal, right? Which is the land, because he's in the land. And so at the same time, this instance is both kind of the same as the initial call of Abraham, but also kind of the same as the binding of Isaac scenario too, right? Because the binding of Isaac scenario, the whole point was you're going to make me into a great nation, but you're asking me to sacrifice the seed of the promise. Mm-hmm. And so you like both of those things are kind of happening now, where it's you're asking me to sacrifice the land. The land's right here. We're already in the land, but you're asking me
12 sons that can live in the land and prosper.
Right. Yeah. We could make this happen, right? And here's the thing: it's like if you're a more cynical like person about who God is and what God's doing, you could just be like, well, God could just make it not be a famine and like give them food there. And it's like, yeah, but like if that's what you think is like the point is just God taking care of like this one individual like family and this one like if you think that it's just, and this is where like, I mean, even like Brooke was talking about like with like the prayer and everything, and like and I've talked with her about it too before about just like whenever she preached on prayer like a couple weeks ago, like on Sunday or whatever, where it's like if you think that the purpose of what God's doing is like just to get you food or just to get you like whatever, it's like you're totally missing like the overarching plan of what he's trying to do and where he's trying to take people. And the whole thing is like God's trying to save the whole world. Like there's more involved with that than just meeting whatever you perceive as like your individual needs. Like, yeah, he's going to do that too, because that might be like a part of it, but that's not his focus. Like there's other stuff going on.
I think it comes down to something that I never really thought about, but that you mentioned it a bunch, how God in like all the Old Testament when he talks is saying like, I'm the guy who brought you out of Egypt.
Yeah.
And it even says right there in verse 4, and I will also bring you up again.
Yes.
And so like if you think about it, like it just kind of clicked now, because I was thinking like, when you said, I was like, oh yeah, it never really occurred to me that, Jacob had his sons as the fourth line of Abraham, and there was 12 of them, and they were in the land and they were prospering. So it's like, oh, I see it going together. And then God throws that curveball. It's like, why the heck is he doing this? It's because of that one line.
Exactly. And I think if you think about it into like a modern context, it's very easy for us to be in a situation where like to turn it into like a preaching point. It's very easy for us to be like, oh, I'm at a church, like I'm doing like stereotypical good churchy things or whatever, but it's entirely possible for God to come along and be like, hey, I'm going to take you out of that and I'm going to take you to this other thing, and it's going to be like way harder and probably is like you might even feel less effective doing that than like what you're doing right now, but that's what I need you to go do, and so like do it. And also with the understanding of this, the thing that I'm calling you to go do might not even get fulfilled in your lifetime.
Mhm.
Right. And that's a thing that, like, I think especially for for modern day, especially like modern day, American Westerners, like, where we do have this, like, God has a plan for your life thing, and we all love, like, Jeremiah so much, right? We all love that verse, like, so much. And it's like the plan for Jeremiah's life really wasn't fulfilled during Jeremiah's life, right? And, like, that's a hard thing for us to get. And it's one of the things where it's like, it's why if you've seen, like, the show A Man in the High Castle, where it's like the Nazis have won or whatever, and like they control, like, the world. It's like the Nazis and the Japanese, like, control the world. My favorite line from that show, and I think about it all the time, is where there's a Jewish guy and he's talking to another guy that is ethnically Jewish but doesn't, like, practice. And he's like, why? He asks the Jewish guy, why don't you fight back? And he goes, like, because, like, the young Jewish, like, ethnically Jewish guy, like, wants to, like, have a revolution, and he's pissed off at the Nazis and, like, wants to go kill
The guy who doesn't practice.
The guy who doesn't practice. And the guy who does goes, what are you talking about? This is fighting back. And it was just having Shabbat. Like, that's what it was. And he was like, one of the things you got to know is we have a much longer view of history than most people. Like, we have a much longer view of history than most people. And it's that mode of thinking where I think that's much closer to a biblical line of thinking. What I mean by that is, like, the way that the authors of the Bible write is more in line with that, where they're thinking generations ahead and, like, eons ahead of being like, where is God trying to take us? How do we get there from where we are now? And they recognize that the way that we get there from where we are now is we follow his plan, and it's a slow plan, but it's way better. Okay. Oh, all right. So anyways, I know that was a lot for getting very far.
I do like yeah, go ahead.
So, I'm pretty sure we've gone over this before.
Yeah.
But why is God speaking to Jacob and saying Jacob, not Israel?
Don't we not know why?
So the correct answer is we don't really know.
Okay.
Right? The more liberal answer is this is an indication of different authors. And and so, like, right, so you would have, like, where it says, so Israel came up, blah 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 blah. Oh, that verse is from one author, and then where he said Jacob blah 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 is from another author, right? Okay, whatever. But even if you have that, you still have an editor that's putting it all together that seemed to have a unified vision. From there could be a reason for it. There could not be a reason for it. There's plenty of other evidence from other ancient texts where when people have multiple names, sometimes it'll hop between them just for, like, differentiation of, like, flavor, right? Same reason why, like, if you're writing your own paper and you used a certain description too much, you break out a thesaurus and, like, you switch it up.
Just say
right?
old guy too much, and I have to say, like,
part of it is, to me, is the idea of, like, it's hard to say because, like, it's almost the same sentence. Like, it's right. It's like and God spoke to Israel in visions of the night, saying, Jacob, Jacob,
Yeah.
right?
That's like the same sentence.
Yeah, it's the same sentence. So to say that it's broken up and it's two authors doesn't even make.
One author is writing random words over here.
Yeah, one author is saying, and God
Set
spoke
one
to
element
Israel
for
the night, and
exercise.
he
And
said,
it starts the sentence and then someone finishes it.
I am God, the God of your father, right? Like it doesn't make any sense, right? And so like I've tried to see, I'm like, okay, is there some kind of pattern of like whenever Jacob messes up or whenever, and it's like, no, it's not. It's obviously not whenever Jacob messes up because Jacob's doing what he's supposed to do right here. Could it be that like when Jacob is undergoing some like kind of transformative like thing of like he's trying to take him from one area to like another and he's trying to do something different? Maybe, I don't know. I've admittedly given up trying to figure it out, and I've never seen, it's a thing that gets talked about a lot, but it's a thing that I've never seen someone give like a definitive answer. And anytime someone tries to give a definitive answer, like the one like during Bible commentary thing, he'll sometimes do this. He always gives answers that I hate, where it'll be like I talked about it like a couple weeks ago, where it's like, oh, this part, like it almost has the same problem as like the more liberal ones, like, right? If you get so conservative to where you say like, oh, whenever he's calling him Israel, he's doing something right. And so this part of his faith is like good. But then whenever he calls him Jacob, this part is bad. And it's like, okay, well here he's just calling him Jacob, Jacob to like be like, hey, are you listening to me? And Jacob goes, yeah, here I am. And also that call and response thing is a classic thing that happens. It's another motif that happens throughout the Bible. And so it's like, why on earth would you say that that's him doing something wrong? Like, so that's him doing something correct.
So a sense I've kind of gotten from the time we've seen the different names between Israel and Jacob is that maybe he's referred to as Israel when he's more embodying the
like,
spirit of the nation
of the group.
Israel. So like the heart of Israel, like when he makes a decision, like, okay, now we're all gonna go. In the previous chapter, it says, and Israel said, it is enough. He's alive. We're gonna go do this. And so it could be in that sense, and God is speaking to Israel. It is kind of, every time it says Israel, it's kind of metaphorical, but every time it says Jacob, it's a little bit more like
the guy,
literal, like the individual Jacob.
Kind of like family, how you can use is and are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Instead of changing the verb, you're changing the subject.
Yeah.
I enjoy that take. Let's roll with it.
Sure.
Evan cracked the code.
Yeah. Go and
Call Michael Heiser right now. Hello, may I speak to Mr. Heiser?
Yeah, we got it right here.
I was just wondering, like this, not a wonder, not a question, I don't know if it's I don't know what it is, but just like the whole idea of how like we know it's important that God takes them out of Egypt, but then of course that begs the question for more critical people, like, well, why did he have to take them out of Egypt in the first place? Like, okay, but in the end, then we're just people like me being brought up in the church. We tend to accept these strange decisions by God and realize that there's probably something in there that we don't quite get.
Yeah,
we're not really
so-
meant to fully get. And so that's just
Say that again. The first part. What was the?
just wondering, like, why does God have to bring them out of Egypt? Like, I get, that he's bringing them down there so that he can constantly refer to himself as the guy who brought them out. But why does it matter that he brought them out? I mean,
well, and so
obviously it's a great thing that he did that, but he didn't really have to do that to prove his greatness. He could have done something else, but he could have done anything else. And so, who's to say what that can be? Other than other than the one who's in charge.
Well,
So,
it would probably be for, again, the parallels and pointing to Jesus with the overall path. When you map on that Egypt is death, and that he sent all of Israel down into death and then brought them out, that maps on to Jesus.
well, yeah, but it is also the case. Like I think there is some level of like it's a little bit arbitrary, because I think it's correct that he could have done something else great.
right, yeah,
Right? I think that is like
but he could have done everything
reasonable.
else great.
But here's the thing, like if he had done something else like I do think that it is necessary, and I mean that in like a philosophical sense of like it had to happen. I do think that it is necessary that God did something on the level of the Exodus to prove his greatness to the people.
And then also, it's not just that he brought them out of Egypt; it's that he walked all over the nations in Canaan and stomped on them when they had really no chance based on their numbers.
Right, like
that honestly, that just reoccurred.
Like he does multiple things, right?
Yeah.
But like, could he theoretically have done like, okay, rather than like going to Egypt and done it like been like, okay, I'm gonna go to like India and did something great like that, or I don't know, did something other thing, and then we'd be sitting here having a Bible study about that great story or something. Like,
why didn't he take him to the UK?
If the story literally changes, we probably change the connotations to match what they are now.
Like, right. That's what I'm saying.
The arbitrary nature of it, in terms of like what actually happened, like it becomes less arbitrary when no matter what he did, the outcome would have
you can't extract the arbitrary nature of what God does, because in the end, he's all knowing and we're not.
Right, and I think that there's probably there's probably a lot of really good reasons why he did it.
Some of which that I think we can see, others of which that we don't even need to go.
And honestly, so there some of these reasons, honestly, like, so they come up in like weird ways, like So like so anytime we get into this territory, right, I'm speculating, right? It's speculation territory.
That's just kind of my idea of bringing this.
So there you have, I guess, what I'll call like the thematic reasons of being like, God needs to show that he's a deliverer. He needs to show that he's powerful. Mm-hmm. He needs to show that he's differentiated from pagan gods. He needs to show how like he will provide and all of these things, right? So you have those. But that's like, oh, that's a little bit arbitrary. That could maybe map on to like he could have gone to India and still done all these things, blah, blah, blah. But then there is also certain practical aspects to it as well that bring it more into the real world. So one is that, okay, if my overall plan is this, I'm taking a particular people and I'm using them as a witness to the whole world. Well, I need that particular people to be in a spot that it's most effective for that message to spread out in the world at the right time, that it's the most effective to spread out in the world.
To be fair, Egypt is like the center of the known world until 1400.
At that time, right?
For 3,000 years. Yeah.
But what's really important is when Jesus comes around, and there's a whole big study that goes on about like population dynamics and how information travels to where when Jesus shows up and how that's correlated with Rome's establishment of their empire and the building of their roads, and how that allowed information transfer that had never been like paralleled, and how like Jesus is like really at the right place, like at the right time for that to happen. And then also to like, to kind of become like the grounding moral framework of really most of the rest of the world, really until Islam comes about like 500 years later and kind of like screws that up, but it's like preserved in England, or not in England, but in Europe rather. But then also Europe ends up being the nation or the region of the earth that develops the fastest with their natural resources, which then leads to colonialism, which spreads out the message really rapidly around the world. And it's like, oh, but colonialism is bad. Yeah, but colonialism also brought about like the spread of the gospel. And it's like, God would use colonialism? Yeah, he's going to use colonialism. Like, he's going to use like everything. And like, are there bad things, and are there things that need to get redeemed? Is there things that need to get like redeemed with like colonialism? It's like, yeah, like but like, but like, if you're gonna be like mad about that, in the same way, the roads that he used during the Roman times to spread out the message.
He also used
Those roads were used to kill people. Roads were a military invention, right? Like that's why if you play Civilization, you play as Rome, it's their soldiers that build roads because roads are a military weapon. And it's like if you pay attention at all to the Bible, one of the things that and you map that onto history, one of the things that you'll see is God continuously uses the power and the tools of empire to subvert empire and to bring about his domain and what he wants. And it's like, what is he doing right here with Egypt? Well, Egypt is the ancient empire, right? Like it's like the first one.
Dog.
It's the top dog, right? And he's going to use that, and he's going to use that as a shield to protect his people and accomplish his goals that he wants to. And he's going to do that like right along. And why is that the case? Well, because they're on the Nile and they're a strong agricultural society. They were able to build up because of their agricultural society. One of the other things that you can do is you can, and what I was trying to get to is there's a video by, I always forget what the letters are, like CGP Grey or whatever. Like maybe you've seen that guy on YouTube or whatever. But he has a video called "Why Was There No America Pox?" And what he means by that is, if you've read the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, it talks about whenever the Europeans came over to the Americas, what was the main like way that they took over? And the main way that they took over wasn't their guns or their steel, although those really helped them. It was really the germs that killed everybody. Well, a little bit, but not even so much. But also you have to remember that at the time they didn't even know about germ theory, so like they didn't know that was gonna cause it, right? But it did cause it. But why did it cause it? Well, the primary reason, but the question was, how come no diseases went from the New World back to the Old World? Well, the first answer is that there were diseases that went back. The main one being syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease, and pirates got it, and explorers and everything got it, which is why there's a joking nickname for syphilis in every in all the countries of Europe. The joking nickname for syphilis is like some other place's disease, right? So like in England, it's like the French disease. In France, it's like the German disease, and like all of this stuff, because the implication is you get it from some foreigner that you had sex with, right? And so like, don't do it. But the whole point is you had sexually transmitted diseases, but you didn't have these like airborne diseases. The reason why is because airborne diseases mostly come from animals and from living in close contact with animals. And if you look at the number of, so like predominantly it was cities where you would have vast amount of animals because you would bring them to the city to do like like markets and stuff. It's where you sold all the meat and everything, right? And so there were, so like people used to talk about how cities were disgusting because like there's tons of animal crap everywhere, and that's what bred a bunch of diseases. Well, in Europe, they had built up immunities to all these diseases, but whenever they took them over to the New World, they didn't have these massive cities where they were constantly in contact with animals all the time, and so they died. And so what you can do is you can do a map of how many domesticated animals are in regions around the world. And if you watch that video, he like puts it up. There's like one for the New World, which is alpacas. Like that's it. That's like all there is. But in Europe, in like there's pigs, goats, horses, blah 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 blah. And one of the things that I noticed is whenever you watch that, the thing that's at the center of all of that is Israel, right? Israel, in addition to be at the center of all these crossroads of trade routes, they're also kind of at the center of where there's a bunch of domesticated animals, which is oddly enough going to come into this, right? And so you have God using also the practical elements of the world that he created, because he knows how those practical elements are going to influence the messages that go out to people and how they're going to get used. And so it's in my opinion that he's positioning people at certain places because he knows how even things like the number of domesticated animals are going to impact civilization 3,000 years in the future. And he knows, like, oh, I'm going to have a move here at this time, develop this, come in contact with this culture, learn these certain things. And I'm going to have them go over here and come into this contact and be doing all of this. And I'm going to have them come over here doing this and doing this. And like, he uses all of that and in ways that like, I have to imagine that that's what he's doing, is something along that type of like super, super high level thinking of like way in advance, which the closest thing that I've ever come to getting into that line of thinking is playing a game like Civilization, right? Because like whenever you're playing like a game like Civilization, the first thing that you're doing is like, okay, what are the resources around me? Okay, how is that going to impact whenever I'm in like the age 2,000 years from now or whatever? That actually came up in a Paul VanderKlay video where he was talking about, where he was like, you know that technically whenever you play the game Civilization, you are kind of like the god of that nation. Like you're not a leader. Like they have you represented by like a leader. Like a lot of times like you're Abraham Lincoln or you're like Gilgamesh or you're whatever. And it's like, yeah, but you're surviving that entire time. You're the cultural god of like, you're the spirit of like that civilization. I'm like, oh, that's a really neat idea. But anyways,
That's a good
that's my answer for why it kind of. So there's the thematic elements for why it had to be Egypt, but there's practical reasons too for why I think it was Egypt, for what God was trying to do in his overall plan.
Well, that answer is more like there's practical reasons for why it's Israel, but then I think there's also further reasons like why not India? Well, because it's not practical to have people move over to India and back.
Right.
Like, what's the closest place that's probable if there's a famine in Israel that you're probably going to go? Well, probably Egypt, especially if you're like in southern Israel.
Like, and it's like, and you can also like, I think it's very fair to objectively say it's like, okay, India has not had the cultural impact on the world that
Egypt was having at the time.
Well, that European nations eventually would have had. And so if he were to take them all the way to India, they might not have been able to like get back to like that like center area. And also maybe just practically from a timeline thing, their empire might not have been as well defined and had as great of access to trade routes. Because if you think about India, okay, what is India surrounded by? A mountain range kind of locks them in. So they have very tenuous relationships, like through most of the centuries with other nations around them, because they can't do massive movements across. And so there's very slow information transfer from India out. Right? Like you have some, but not nearly as much as what you have going on in the Middle East, right? Like it's way more. And most of the information transfer that's going on in India is to the islands that are in like that are down lower. Like, and you have a little bit onto like the west coast of Africa, but all of those are also like more secluded areas that so like maybe he could have done something like that and use India. I think that's a interesting thought experiment, but I just don't think that they had anything rivaling.
I think like if all
Egypt
that
at the time
is God's plan, and he's just like, all right, I just need to pick a place where to send them. Like Egypt there's just the ease to it. Like if all you need to do is take them out of a civilization,
yeah,
why not just pick the closest one?
Yeah, sure.
And that way, that even makes this story stronger for how they were lost in the desert for 40 years. Well, it didn't matter how close they were to where their destination was. It mattered that how far they were from the guy that was leading them to that destination.
Yes. Yeah.
I accidentally made that really good. I'm sorry.
How dare you? I forgive you.
All right, let's keep going.
Then Jacob set out from Beersheba. The sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, their little ones, and their wives in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry him.
I don't know why he
They
mentions
also
those,
took
but
the
okay.
livestock and the
Oh,
goods which they had gained in the land of
Made a
Canaan.
nice cover, man.
When you mentioned the wagons, yeah.
The wagons
I was
from the
thinking of verse 6, which is coming up.
Are these
Oh.
Israelite
I-
wagons where they have?
No,
No, these are the Egyptian wagons.
The ones that they were told to take.
he named
twice
out
in
the
different
Pharaoh
times.
that these are Pharaoh's wagons.
These are the nice
Pharaoh had sent the carrier.
pharaohific wagons.
Pharaoh, boom.
I don't know.
And came into Egypt, Jacob and all his offspring with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters. All his offspring he brought with him into Egypt.
Okay, so they did. We went past it without me actually.
Well, say whatever one you say.
In 6, verse 6 is they also took their livestock and their goods which they had gained in the land of Canaan,
Mhm.
which we remember from last week when Pharaoh had a double speak moment where he said the same thing twice. I mentioned that the only thing he said in this, one of the only things he said in the second time when he reiterated it himself was to not bring anything of your own because you won't need it when you get here.
Mm.
And that's listed here that they did it. They did it anyway.
Yeah, they brought everything. Yeah, so I guess so there is a little bit of that, and that's actually what we're going to get into a little bit. Is there's like a mini plot that kind of happens at the end here, which is that like Pharaoh wanted them to do like a certain thing, which is that Pharaoh wants them to assimilate, and they're going to intentionally not.
Right.
And part of the way that they do that is by bringing their own stuff, right? Which I mean, even has practical. Like you think about when Ben Shapiro talks about like going to like eat with friends or whatever, he's like, I got to bring my own food or whatever because because I got to eat kosher or whatever. And it's like that's kind of like a mini like version of this where it's like, okay, I'm preserving my identity by bringing my own food and bringing my own stuff like to the thing that's like going to happen. And it's like a sign of like I'll be around you and like participate with you, but I'm my own thing. But I wanted to spend, this is probably not worth the time. But I've had a weird thing that I've been like struggling with, not struggling with, but like thinking about lately is there's this idea of you like the way that Jewishness is passed down is by your mom being Jewish, which like I've been thinking about that like on and off, like not majorly, but I'm like, where does it actually say that? And like I never like found it. And today I found it was just like especially after reading that verse, because the first thing whenever it goes his sons, his sons, his daughters, and his sons' daughters, I was like, what about his daughter's sons and his daughter's daughters? Like they're not listed. And I was like, where does it actually say that line about like you're Jewish if your mom is Jewish? And I found like an article that was talking about it. Apparently nowhere, but people.
I assume rabbinic, like,
but it's a
tradition.
it's a rabbinic tradition that comes up later. But in the rabbinic tradition, they assume, like they do with a lot of rabbinic traditions, they assume that it's always been that way. Like it
Right.
always was that way. And I'm just like, well, if that's the case, whenever you get to this verse, you literally can't say that all of Israel went down because it doesn't list. And what you would have to say is just like, oh, like he didn't let his daughters marry outside. Like they were all like okay, but like it seems pretty weird that like all of his sons are married at this point, but none of his daughters are married. Like none of his daughters are given birth yet. Like, okay.
Which did they mention how many like actual daughters he himself had?
You have
Just-
Dinah, and that's the only one that gets mentioned. But you also have
but
daughters here.
But in terms of sons, they're including grandchildren, so there's got to be some daughters in there.
Yeah, like
Especially as they list and his son's daughters.
And his son's daughters.
So they exist.
yes, exactly.
And some of his grandchildren also have children. So
Right.
yeah.
And so to me, it just seems to be like it probably actually is that ancient Israelites were basically the same as everybody else, where they considered like the sons to all be like of like the same like family.
Yeah, that line just makes way more sense if it's
But
a Jewish tradition that
they
develops later.
also allow like foreign women to come in and join, but whenever they do that, they need to like give up their old gods, which is why whenever like the verses that they were citing was like stuff in like Ezra, where it's like, oh, all these Israelite men have married all these foreign gods. We need to get rid of their wives, and they need to marry like they need to marry Israelite women. And the point was more about like getting rid of the gods than it was that, because also there's plenty of famous stories about foreign women being like
A problem.
well, no, actually not a problem. The opposite of a problem.
There are also
Be-
ones of them being
Like
There's plenty of them being a
there's
problem.
plenty of them being a problem, but like
There's
being
600
very
things.
important members like Ruth, right? And actually,
No, I just mean all
if we
songs.
think
Well, right, yes.
like, and we actually even had one earlier, which is Tamar, right? So Judah and Tamar. Tamar is a Canaanite, right? And so you
What's
then
her face? She has a whole book. Ruth, she's born.
well,
She has a-
So look, I was talking to him.
I already mentioned Ruth. You missed it. Yeah. But and actually, and then in the line of the line of Jesus, he's got 4 specifically mentioned foreign women, whom Rahab and and also the Solomon's mom. Yeah, Bathsheba.
The
She
bathing.
wasn't a Jewish lady?
Nope.
Well, it says
Well-
her husband was a Hittite. Does it ever say what she is?
Yeah, she's supposed to
That's
like
true.
I think she's a Hittite too. Yeah,
Oh.
she's foreign. But yeah. So, anyways, the point is that I just wanted to mention that to be like, this seems like a pretty good verse to be like, that's probably not true. Yeah, it took too long to spend.
Talk about the
Noting to the names of the descendants of Israel who
Yeah,
came
exactly.
to Egypt, Jacob and his sons. Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and the sons of Reuben, Hanok, Palu, Hezron, and Carmi. The sons of Simeon, Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Jachin, Zohar, and Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. The sons of Levi, Gershon,
He counts.
Kohath, and Merari. The sons of Judah, Onan, Shelah, Perez, and Zerah. But and Onan died in the land of Canaan. And the sons of Perez were Hezron and Hamor.
So
The
wait.
sons of Issachar,
Never mind Sheila.
Hold on.
Yob, and
Let's get to the
Shimon.
end of it.
Okay.
The sons of Zebulun,
I have another point
Sarah,
at the end of it.
Elon, and Jaliel. These are the sons of Leah, whom she bore to Jacob in Paddan Aram, together with his daughter Dinah. Altogether his sons and his daughters numbered 33.
Yeah.
So and Onan, we're just counting them, and they came along. In what fashion did they come along? Did they die on the way? Or did
No,
they bring their
no,
bodies?
they specifically don't get counted. They actually don't get counted, which is
Are they not in that total? Listed
they're not listed. In
okay,
the
then
total.
that's important. Sure.
Yes, and
Because
we're going to talk about
the number
that.
total is important at the end. Of
Yes, and we're going to talk about that.
Maybe Judah just decided to sacrifice him.
Sacrifice who?
Or was it Reuben that said he's going to sacrifice his sons?
It's Reuben that said he was going to sacrifice.
Oh,
No, he didn't
one
sacrifice.
guy.
You said he killed himself.
No,
Oh,
and Onan are not included in
Confusing
the list.
us.
That's why that parentheses is there. But and Onan died in the land of Canaan. They're not included.
The sons of Gad, Ziphion, Haggai, Shunai, Esbon, Eri, Arodai, and Aralai. The sons of Asher, Imnah, Ishva, Ishvi, Beriah, with Sarah their sister. And the sons of Beriah, Heber and Malchiel. These are the sons of Zilpah, whom Laban gave to Leah his daughter, and these she bore to Jacob, 16 persons. The sons of Rachel, Jacob's wife, Joseph and Benjamin. And to Joseph in the land of Egypt were born Manasseh and Ephraim, whom Asenath the daughter of Potiphar the priest of On bore to him. And the sons of Benjamin, Bela, Becher, Ashbel, Gera, Naaman, Ehi, Rosh, Mupim, Hupim, and Ard.
Mupim and Hupim.
Sons of Rachel,
Hupim and Ard.
Jacob,
Hard.
14 persons in all.
It's a
The
great
son of
story.
Dan, Hushim. The sons of Naphtali, Jaziel, Guni,
Dan just getting flexed on with one son of Hushim.
Dan wasn't the most
Jesus,
friendly
Shalom.
guy.
Wasn't.
I really
These
do
are
want
the
to see a
sons
short
of
story
Bilhah,
about
whom Laban gave to Rachel his daughter, and these she bore to Jacob, 7 persons in all. All the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own descendants, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph, who were born to him in Egypt, were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70.
Okay. So, yeah. So basically, so one thing that's going on there is, again, it's a genealogy list, and genealogy lists usually indicate like, hey, we're kind of at the end of like a story, but there's a little bit of a narrative that's going to play out. But it's really to get to this number 70, and for all the persons of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70. So we've mentioned that. I think we've mentioned this before. Like, why is this a big deal? The reason why this is a big deal is because the number 70 gets used to indicate kind of like cosmic, like what I mean by like cosmic, as in like the whole world, like the cosmos, like the whole world, like rulership. So like rulership over of like everything. So like we talked earlier about like there are 70 nations, right? And they get mapped out. Here is kind of the first instance of the number 70 showing up in the nation of for Israel, and right, and so it's going to be from that 70 that God earlier in the chapter, he's like, I'm going to make this into a nation, right? So it's like, so he had one seed and now he's got like 70 seeds, right? And that's going to grow, and then in the time of the Exodus, it's going to be huge. He's going to have a ton, but from out of like depending upon what number you have, anywhere from like a couple 100,000 to like up to a couple million, right? And that gets debated in Exodus a lot. But you then get 70 elders, and those 70 elders are what help Moses govern the people, and for governing the nation, that's going to be the kingdom of priests. And then that gets played out again later whenever Jesus comes around, and from out of that nation, Jesus picks 70 disciples and he sends them out into pairs, and that's like his first sending out to spread his message, right? And so it's that continual like line and amplifying up, and the idea is that eventually like that the like the house of the Lord, which is going to be come from these like lines of seeds, and from these like these ever growing like representatives of God, are eventually going to replace the 70 like rulers of the nations, which is why you have this line about, or this idea of, we will join God in the divine council. And that's why you have this line about, and you will judge angels, right? So like, if you remember like that verse where it's like, and you like, and don't you know you will judge angels? And like the idea is like, once we're all like brought up and we are like in the divine council, and like we're helping serve Christ, we'll be judging like the nations and everything along with him. And it's like, it's still that like he's the ultimate judge and everything, and blah blah blah, but like that progression, this is like a part of it, and it's a big deal. So as a part of that, we're going to analyze this number a little bit here. And so one of them that I thought was interesting was from that more critical line, because, right, if you remember the critical commentary, they're like, oh, all of these names are representative of clans and everything, like, coming together. But I don't want to spend too much time on that, but this one line stood out to me, and it says, in the mind of the writer of the present passage, these two traditional schemes appear to have gotten mixed up and confused. As it stands, it is neither an accurate enumeration of Jacob's descendants. So remember, they think that there's two different sources coming together to make that. And I think that one is trying to say, oh, this is just a list of Jacob's descendants. And then another guy later on is trying to say, oh, no, this is a list of all of the people that are going to go down into Egypt with him. And this critical author is like, well, the list is technically neither of those things. So here's the reason why it's neither of those things. The number includes Jacob. So it's obviously not who comes with him, because the number includes Jacob, but it also excludes and Onan. And so it is not a list of his descendants, because like that number 70 is not the number of his descendants, because it excludes and Onan. Nor is it a list of those who accompany him to Egypt, because it embraces Joseph and his sons who are already there. My response to this is pretty easy. Joseph isn't Israel until his whole family is there. And so even though it doesn't happen all in the same, at the same temporal time of going down, Israel going down is a process that began with Joseph being sold into slavery and all of that happening and all that story happening, and concludes with the rest of them coming down. That whole event is Israel coming down. And in that whole event, well, that includes Joseph and his kids. And so now Israel as a group is in Egypt.
Yeah, it's funny because I was thinking that the list of names plus the number actually better fits both of the descriptions. You said it was neither of. I would say it's closer to say it's both than it is to say that it's neither.
It's neither.
Because it is both a full genealogy of Jacob to all the remaining living and recently dead, but previously not mentioned members of.
But specifically commenting on the number, he's commenting on what is the number trying to say.
Right, but the number does accurately refer to these are all the people that are now part of the nation of Israel, and it's in Egypt. And also, I think it's really cool, and I'm sure you've recognized this, that like specifically the number 66 going into 70 plays a big, like, from a Pajoian instance here, is you have that 66 kind of representing man's attempt at completion without,
because it's Jacob God, and everybody back home.
And then you include Jacob, and his 4 are the additional, because Jacob plus his wife plus 2 children are the 4 added in. But you can also look at Jacob as a representation of God's will and God's inclusion into the total to make 70. I think it's really cool.
You're saying Jacob, you mean Joseph, right?
I do mean Joseph.
You mean Joseph.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You had me, and then you.
I was going to correct him too, but
we're talking James.
What? You're right. But you're right. The thing that God is doing by and you do have that remainder portion.
Right.
That remainder portion is the seed, right? Because we've talked about that a lot whenever we talked about like the number and everything, about like the remainder portion is the seed. It is the thing that God uses to preserve the whole. Like that's exactly what's going on there with that, is that Joseph and his family down here are the remainder portion that ends up preserving the whole.
Which is why, again, I get that I mentioned Pajot, because he literally talks about this in his video about 666, which is why this 66 actually has more in common with like that number. Well, in his description of what he means by that number. That number is taking man's attempt at a perfect working and perfect ordering of the world.
Yeah.
66 is taking that to the extreme. In this case, 66 is there's a little bit of evil in it because it's only 66 because of the workings of the brothers from 4.
Yes.
But when you include Joseph into and the full workings of the story, now you're at 70. Perfect. That's a full circle.
Right.
That's including God. So there's a lot in just that bit of it there.
All right, we're gonna finish this up.
Had sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to show the way before him in Goshen. And they came into the land of Goshen. Then Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet Israel his father in Goshen. He presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on.
There was like a bunch of talk about like what is he sending Judah to go do? It seems to me that what Judah was sent to go do is to go tell Joseph that they were coming back so that Joseph could meet them in Goshen. Right? Because we sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to show the way before him in Goshen. Right? They're like, well, what is he actually doing? Like, because like they don't they were trying to, like, the one commentary was trying to say that like that Judah was like their guide to Goshen, but it's like, no, Judah's going to Joseph to get him to go to Goshen because Goshen is not as far as Egypt proper. Like that's what he's doing.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
His neck a good while. Israel said to Joseph, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive."
I also wanted to pause there because I just feel like that's because we've been talking a lot about like his kind of like, right, he's had this own mini arc going on of like being reserved and resigned about just like his fate, and this is like, I see this as like the ending of that arc of just being like, I'm ready to die now, like, because God has fulfilled it, like, and everything's great. He's not going to die now. He lives for like another 17 years. But
he's right.
But from like a story aspect,
that's like a couple weeks.
he's like he's satisfied with like the result and everything. And so yeah, I just wanted to point that out.
Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, 'My brothers and my father's household, who are in the land of Canaan, have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, "What is your occupation?" you shall say, "Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth even until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians."
So
Nice wording.
so this is like what I'm like thinking of as like, it's like the kind of final like mini plot of like the story is this whole thing about him being like, oh, tell him, make sure that you tell him that you, like, he's not asking them to lie. He's just like, make sure you emphasize that you're shepherds, right? And like, and you also have this idea of like, well, why is he doing that? Well, I think that goes back into the earlier point that we made about like this is going to be the means of you being able to preserve your identity in when you're in the land of Egypt, is because the Egyptians don't like shepherds, so you'll be able to get their protection, but be outside of what they want to interact with, and so you won't mix to a level that's a problem. The only thing that I wanted to mention here is that again, one of the more like some of the more critical commentaries, there was a lot of skepticism about whether or not the Egyptians actually didn't like shepherds, which I found to be funny, because so like this was the line, moreover, while there is evidence that swine herds and cow herds were looked down upon by the Egyptian, this statement that shepherds were held in special abhorrence has not been confirmed. And that was a statement that I was like, all right, you're kind of like really grasping at straws here. Like to find like a problem in the text. Like, and literally, and so like he has citations for the other ones. One is Herodotus, and I actually forget what the other one was. He had a different one for cowherds. So he's like, we have plenty of evidence that they didn't like pig herders and that they didn't like swine herders, but we don't have any evidence that says that they don't like goat herders.
And it's like, take those two pieces of evidence and combine it with this piece of evidence to say they didn't like
herders, right? It's like, oh, also with the fact that we know that they're predominantly an agricultural society where they grow things, like no, it's just that they thought that they were gross because they think that animals are gross. Duh, because animals are
the Cherokee are over there going, the live what now?
Yeah, right.
The keepers of what?
Yeah, like no, don't do that. Just grow food. Like it's way better. Yeah, like so it's just it's a good example of I thought that was a good example of a thing where it's like, well, let's pretend that the Bible just didn't even have this line. Would you even show that same level of skepticism towards like what Herodotus says about them not liking pig herders? Like are there a lot of people that are around that are like, you know, Herodotus says that the Egyptians don't like pig herders, but I just don't know if I believe him.
I don't buy it.
I love pig herders. Well, yeah, this other guy said they didn't like cow herders, but like
Herodotus must be mistaken.
Yeah, we're gonna assume that he's like no, like so like also just understand that like sometimes the level of skepticism that's shown by critical scholars towards like the Bible is just utterly ridiculous. It's just like no, it makes sense with what we know about Egyptians and what we know about people in general that, yeah, probably also didn't like goat herders, like for the same reason that they didn't like those other types of herders.
No, sheep are very cool.
And there is also some
big,
but
cow,
but they have them,
Chicken.
and because when we get back next week, they actually get put in charge of like Pharaoh's cattle, so they have them, but they specifically have them far away from them. So we'll talk about that more next week. But yeah, that went actually longer than what I thought it was because I didn't know it's been that much time.
We had some big questions.
Any other comments or questions before we wrap up here?
Nothing else.
Okay.
I realized that it's kind of cool. Maybe not cool, just like I realized that Jacob is like
get a dog someday.
the biggest character who just kind of comes back after having his time in the spotlight because like he's a main character for like 9 chapters, then he's gone. Like most other main characters in the narratives of the
It's
Bible,
them.
once they're gone, bye, see you later.
Yeah.
But then he comes back for a couple times and it's like, oh right, Jacob, right, of course.
Well, it's mostly because of like time frame. Because
Right,
like
yeah.
have like generational shifts.
It's like
And because he's still a father and lives long enough for his sons to have a big enough story, as well as being, like I said, he's the heart of Israel, so it kind of matters for.
right, yeah. It's just like an interesting thing that I kind of noticed.
Yeah.
I think
big of a
second place
character.
is like maybe Samuel because he makes a brief comeback.
Yeah, he did some stuff.
That's about it. No one comes close to the big man.